So the risk that people face when they're lonely is of the same magnitude. People face the same amount of risk as folks who are smoking cigarettes or are obese. And it's a very similar level, right? So that's why we're talking about it as a major public health challenge. Hi, I'm Marc Schulz, and I'm a professor of psychology and the director of data science at Bryn Mawr College. I'm also the co-author of The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Study of Happiness. In today's episode, Chase and I are going to be talking about that study and the lessons that you can use to live a more meaningful and satisfying life.
The Good Life. That name says it all. It's one that I am in pursuit of, and I know for damn sure all of my listeners and viewers here are as well, but I'm going to spin it and say, a good life means living a life ever forward, which we will get to your interpretation at the end, Dr. Schulz. So first of all, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show. And your book, The Good Life, stood out to me so much because you are really highlighting evidence, proof of something that I talk about so much here on the show and adds so much meaning to my life, and that's meaningful relationships. I got to ask, why now? Why a book focused on meaningful relationships? Why was now the time for this to come out to the world?
Yeah, great question. So first, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you. This was a book that's a long time coming. I've been involved in what's really the world's longest study of happiness. I've been involved personally for the last 20 years, but the study itself has been going on for over 80 years. And we've learned a lot about what helps people flourish. It's a fairly unique study because it follows people really intensively and closely. So it's an interview-based study. It included visits to the people's homes when they first started in the study when they were adolescents, and we continued to follow them closely throughout their whole life. So we were sitting on a lot of information, a lot of science, and my colleague and I have published in lots of articles, and the study itself is over hundreds of articles published related to the research. And we thought it was really time to bring this to a broader audience. So our goal in writing The Good Life was really to take the findings and the lived lives, the experiences of over 720 individuals and their families, and to bring it to people in a way that would help them live lives that included more meaning and purpose and joy. Yeah, that's really our goal. And certainly we didn't quite imagine when we started writing more than 2.5 years ago that there was going to be a pandemic, but the pandemic happened. It made it a little easier to write the book in some ways because we were socially isolated. But it also means that I think this idea about connection has a special message today that we're all trying to figure out as we come out of the pandemic, how to reestablish our connections, how to make meaning in those connections. So it feels like it's really the right time. I wish I could say that was by design. Actually, I wish I could say it wasn't by design, because of course I wish the pandemic didn't happen. Yeah.
That really, I think, resonates so strongly in one of the first sections I kind of marked here in the book. It's a hard fact. Scientific studies have told us again and again, human beings need nutrition, we need exercise, we need purpose, and we need each other. This kind of fourth marker for what makes humans humans, and dare I even say, what makes us happy to be humans and what keeps us well and thriving. Can you expand on that last facet there, please? Why do we need each other? And I think it's so unique, like you just wrapped up there, that I think we're realizing this now more than ever coming out of this global pandemic.
Right. So we stepped back a bit as we started to work on the book and tried to think about, across the 80 plus years of the study and across the hundreds of scientific papers, what was the kind of signal here? What was the main take home? And when we kind of zone back a little bit or pull back and look at the big picture, what we see is that relationships are the signal, that's the thing that really keeps people flourishing in their lives. Why is that important? Relationships are important in so many ways that we underestimate. They help us thrive when we face stress. That's maybe the part that we're most clear on. But on the other end of the spectrum, they also help us experience our most intense joy. If you think about the daily experience that you have, it's often with other people that we feel our strongest emotions. Oftentimes it's good emotions, but it can also be more negative emotions as well. So relationships are kind of essential part of life, and they certainly nourish us in critical ways. And the reason why they're so important probably goes back to kind of evolutionary history, that in order to protect ourselves tens of thousands of years ago or even more, we needed to band together, just like animals do, to protect themselves and to shelter together. And that kind of evolutionary pressure, of course, we experience less. Most of us in the modern world are in fairly well shaped structures and shelters, and we are able to feed ourselves. Most of us, at least, are privileged to do that. But we still need each other. That's an evolutionary pressure that's important. And when we don't have that connection, it hurts us. It hurts us both psychologically and it hurts us physically as well.
Yeah, you said it so perfectly there. This other section that stood out to me, you talked about how positive relationships are essential to human well-being. And I love that kind of nuance there of how it's not just, I think everybody would agree, we need food, we need water, we need kind of those fundamentals that you highlighted earlier in the book. But when we say that we need each other, it kind of sounds, for lack of a better term, needy. Nobody likes to, feel needy or really, I think, wants to be around needy people. But when we break down that nuance, if we need it for our well-being, that I think brings on a totally different meaning and application. So if you could please expand a little bit more when we're talking about the well-being of humans, why in fact do we need each other?
Right. So I think it is needy in a certain way. What's changed is our discussion about what neediness means, right? So when we talk about this as a basic human need akin to food and shelter, I mean that we need that to survive. And the clearest evidence is the evidence that's coming in more and more every day about the cost of loneliness. So in the United States and many Western countries, and even in industrialized Eastern countries as well, there's a kind of growing sense of isolation and disconnection. People experience that as feeling lonely, and the percentages are startling, on the order of 30, 40, even 50% in some surveys. And it's at all ages. One of the big surprises is that young people experience rates of loneliness that are among the highest across the lifespan. And what we find, so in addition to the widespread nature of loneliness, it's also corrosive in the sense that we're clear that people who are lonely don't live as long. So there's a higher risk of morbidity, of dying, and they experience more illness than others. And this is true across many, many studies. So it's not just one study that's found it, but it's across many studies. We can aggregate that finding. And we're able to say that the risk that people face when they're lonely is akin, it's on the same order of magnitude as the risk people face when they're obese or when they smoke cigarettes for our health. And that's pretty
Go back and please
extraordinary,
say that
right?
again. Please, that's powerful. Please repeat that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the risk that people face when they're lonely is of the same magnitude. People face the same amount of risk as folks who are smoking cigarettes or are obese. And it's a very similar level, right? So that's why we're talking about it as a major public health challenge. And you probably know, Chase, that in England, they've raised this to such a degree that they have a cabinet level minister of loneliness that's supposed to address this with public health projects.
No, I had
So
no idea. This is real life?
this is real life. Yeah, real
Wow.
life.
All
Yeah.
right. Go UK. That's amazing.
Yeah, pretty amazing stuff. And there are a lot of initiatives in the United States also at the public level and also the private level trying to think about how we can reduce loneliness, right? When we're talking about 30 to 50% of the population, this is a widespread problem, and we know it has serious health consequences.
Wow. I mean, that cracked things open in a whole nother way for me. And, for the listener, really think about, this is a concept where, okay, I can think about how this looks, implies, to my life. But when you pan out, how does loneliness turn into a macro problem, public health issue? I had not even thought about that. I mean, it makes sense when we have loneliness, we have all these unwanted health traits of our well-being that get worse or we don't even experience. I mean, that's a ripple effect. You're going to take that onto the world. I mean, that's going to, well, I guess maybe not. I mean, if you're lonely, maybe you're not going out into the world, but having people like this experiencing these troubles out into the world, of course, is going to cause bigger problems for the mass public.
I think that's right. And we were joking about whether they're really going out into the world or not. And what I want to make clear is that loneliness is a kind of internal experience. It's a feeling that we have, and people feel lonely even when they're in a crowd, whether they're in a marriage, whether they're college students with thousands of other, kids their own age. That loneliness is a subjective experience. It's a sense that I feel disconnected, that I don't have people that I can trust or can count on. And that's one of the keys, I think, to why it's corrosive, but its power there. But it's pretty widespread. So people do take it around with them because they're lonely people that we see at work. They're lonely people that we see on the train and the subway every day. They're all around us, for sure.
And this kind of brings me to the next point I wanted to cover, your section on social fitness.
Mhm.
I love making the connections and analogies to the physical aspect of well-being. I think because it's so powerful. When we want to get better in our health, or we want to train something, what do? We try to get active. We join a gym. We go for a run. We try to work on honoring the external self. But we take that same model to exercise and put it to the self of happiness, of meaningful relationships. What does that actually mean? And what do you mean by the term social fitness? And what does that actually look like?
Yeah, so this is an idea that starts with the premise that we often take for granted our ability to make social connections and our social fitness, how good we are at making those connections. And what we find is that people who take that for granted, their relationships wither and they experience that sense of loneliness. So the critical idea is, just like physical fitness, we need to work on it. And we probably also need to check in and do assessments of our social fitness. How are we doing? Are we making the connections that are important to us? Are we, finding the things that we need in terms of support in our life? There are a bunch of things that we can do, and I'm happy to talk in more detail about them, that allow us to think about what our priorities might be for improving our social fitness. So the metaphor goes further, though, right? There are things that we can do to exercise those muscles. So we can work on being more present when we talk to people. We can work on being more attentive to trying to understand what someone else is both communicating to us and what their experience may be. That's even harder, to try and put yourself in the
Practicing
shoes of
more
someone else.
attunement, correctly? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there are a whole bunch of skills that are related to social fitness that we can get better at. And I want to say early in the interview that one of the kind of remarkable findings from this study, because we follow people across their entire lifespan, is that it's never too late to change. So we have an incredible story towards the end of the book of a gentleman who, through his 60s, was quite lonely. He was in a marriage that wasn't really satisfying for him, and they were disconnected. And he experienced acute states of loneliness and was quite depressed. And he decided, after some help, he decided to separate from his wife. And he also was experiencing some health problems. So he had recently retired and he loved his work. So he was in a kind of hard place, but he decided to join a gym because he wanted to work on his fitness, his health, his physical health. And at the gym, he found people that were there every day that he could say hello to at first. And over time, he realized that some of these folks, this is, mind you, in his late 60s, that some of these folks were interested in some of the same things he was. So one example was he loved movies, and he started to see if people from the gym would go with him to movies or come back to his house and watch them on television with him. And suddenly he had a social network that he had never had his entire life, which was quite extraordinary. So this idea about social fitness, really important metaphor, and we can get fit at any age.
You bring up a really interesting point, and I do want to dive into this study. I mean, because we've been kind of highlighting some big picture items, but before we get there, I think this aspect of social fitness is what I would recommend the most, and what I would say has worked the best for me if I'm moving to a new area, or I just want to get out of my norm a little bit. I would recommend, because I do it, I go do my norm. I go about my day, the things that I want to do, my routines, my routes, my coffee, my gym, my whatever, and just begin to kind of pay attention to the people that you're probably seeing do the same thing at the same place at the same time. That, I think, is you're in. That is the in, and it's not always easy to start new relationships, to break the ice, but especially, I'm sure, in your 60s, that probably is even more difficult. Especially if this gentleman was coming out of a marriage. I mean, he's probably figuring out, well, what do I want to do? Who am I? What interests me? But I think there's a great way there, some great solace to be found in just routine and you joining other people in the same routine.
Absolutely. And the key though is it sounds like, Chase, you're an active person, right? You have a life that exists outside of your house, and not everyone has that. So for those folks, they may need to alter their routine. They may need to think about ways to make those connections. And I think you started by, going to get coffee, going to the gym. That activities are an important way to do it. So joint activities are great. This fellow that we just talked about in the book, what a brilliant idea he figured out in his late 60s, but it was really serendipitous. It was just a coincidence because he learned about some health issues and he really wanted to lose some weight. And that's what got him to the gym. But what he ended up with, the real gift he ended up with, was the connections that he made with others.
And speaking of new connections in routine, one just came to mind, and this is a whole nother kind of lesson beyond just paying attention to the people where you're at, paying attention to the people on the way to where you're going to be. One example comes to mind is, long story short, I recently became a new friend. I met this new older gentleman. He's, I think, like 80s. And I was walking to the gym, like I always do around the same time. And this gentleman seemed to be struggling with his phone. He was standing on his phone. And, I've tried to develop a practice of doing the thing that I'm doing, meaning when I'm walking, I'm walking. I'm not walking on my phone. And I saw him just kind of struggle. And I stopped to ask him if I could help. And he couldn't figure out a setting or something. And then like 2 weeks later, around the same time, on the same route, I saw this gentleman again. And he wasn't struggling with his phone. Thankfully, I fixed it, but he was peering into a window, and I recognized him because I was present in the moment, and I recognized the same guy on the same path. And we got to talking, and he has this incredible, amazing backstory. He's invited my wife and I over for dinner, and apparently he has this amazing French collection of wine. And he told me he was in the Israeli army. So I'm like, you have stories, sir. You have stories.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just another example of even just in transit to find new people and new things and meaningful relationships. You can find one on your own.
I love that story. And everyone has a backstory, right? Everyone is interesting.
Shout out Alfredo if you're ever tuning in, man. That's his name.
But those kinds of, just lucky connections that we make, and this was more than luck. You stopped to do a good thing and to be helpful to folks. But there's a great study that we talk about in the book. It was a study done by some researchers at the University of Chicago, and they asked people in the morning commute. They asked them before they got on the L. This was in Chicago. They said, what do you like to do on the train? And almost everyone said they listen to music, podcasts, or they sleep, or they just sort of sit there by themselves. Most people said they never talk to strangers. And because they were psychologists and we tend to do kind of, cruel things, they randomly asked half of them to talk to a stranger. Right? Our kind of worst nightmare for some of us. And then they caught them at the end of the L ride after they got off the train, and they asked everyone how they were feeling. They had asked them how they were feeling before. And the surprising result was, maybe not surprising given what we said, the folks that were forced to talk to strangers reported that they were happier, much happier than they were if they had done their normal routine. So I think we have this idea that we should avoid strangers. I shouldn't get involved. That old man seems complicated. I'm going to be here forever. It's not worth it for us. And what we find is that little jolt of energy that we get, right? I could see it. You were lighting up as you were talking about them. That jolt of energy that we get is a good thing for our body. It's a good thing for our spirit too. So I love those kinds of connections during the day, the opportunity to say hello to someone that I don't know. And even better if I get to know something about them, right? A hello is good. Really getting to know something about them even better.
Yeah, truly. And for me, I think the good life is waiting for me outside of my own life. When I get out of my own way, and by that I mean truly just becoming more present and mindful of what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, where and why. And also it's a whole other thing for productivity. I really try to just focus on the one thing, because multitasking, at least for me, is the biggest lie I've ever told myself. But then when that even filters down, I'm truly present with what I'm doing. And especially if that's with another human being, that fuels that relationship for damn sure. So the good life for me is just getting out of my own way and recognizing that my life is not the only contributing factor here.
Absolutely. So in the book, we talk about it this way, that we talk about attention as really being the most valuable thing that we possess. And we don't tend to think about it with a metaphor like money, but if you thought about attention as something that you only had so much of, and you can only spend it on certain things. The
Ah,
key
yeah.
question is, where do you spend that attention, right? So if you spend it all the time focused on yourself, you're missing out on those opportunities to learn about other people, to connect with other people. So our attention is such a valuable thing. So I really like what you're saying, right? You figured it out that you need to spend time giving that attention to others because it enriches us. It also enriches them as well, but
Truly.
it enriches us as well in important ways.
Well, please, if we can now, let's really crack open this study a little bit more. I mean, the length of it, the frequency and types of check-ins that you all had, and just it was both quantitative and qualitative. There were so many hard markers and data sets, but also
That's right. Yeah.
how do you feel? How are you feeling today? And just I love this concept because you guys, for me, really left no stone unturned when it comes to measuring quality of life.
So this is really an extraordinary study. It started long before I was born, even. It started in the 1930s. And it's two groups of individuals. So one group was a group of inner city boys. This is about 2/3 of the sample. There were 724 participants when the study began in the 1930s. And almost 2/3 of them were kids that were growing up in some of the worst and most impoverished neighborhoods of Boston. They typically lived in tenement buildings, most of them without running water. So these were kids that were really in families that were struggling, had very few resources. Most of the families from that cohort had immigrated to the United States, so they were also experiencing the challenge of immigration. The remaining 1/3 of the sample were students from a very different walk of life. They were students not far away from these neighborhoods in Boston. They were at Harvard University, and they began the study as participants that were supposedly normal kids that were thriving in some way. And the study had an unusual focus for a study at that time, and even today. It was really interested in trying to understand what helps people thrive, as opposed to just trying to understand pathology or medical problems. So from the very beginning, the questions that were asked were really about what's leading people to do well in these circumstances. Some of the participants really challenging, and some of them in circumstances that were certainly much more privileged, being at Harvard at that point. This was 1930s. It began with extensive interviews. So the study got to know the participants. They also went to visit the homes where the participants grew up, and they interviewed the parents. They looked around and they rated what they saw, how clean the households were, how organized they were, how many kids were there. So it was a very kind of holistic approach to trying to understand people's lived experience. And that's the key part, that this study is unique because all across its lifespan, the 80 plus years it's been going on, it's been, the foundation has been interviews to get to know people and visits. Later in life, we did things like observe people talking about challenges with their partner. We videotaped them and watched them very closely as they did that. We checked in over an 8-day period. We checked in repeatedly to see sort of what they did during the day and how those events might be linked to their mood. So it's a study that was really interested in lived experience. It used interviews and these kinds of very close methods. As you said, also very objective and sort of state-of-the-art biomarkers as the study got going. So we have brain scan data on these folks and the latest psychological tests. So flourishing, length of time, and then this wonderful feature, which I want to highlight, these two very different walks of life, right? So you have kids that were growing up in kind of very challenging circumstances, and then kids that maybe on the surface of it looked like they had already made it at 18 years of age. They were headed to Harvard University, which meant the same thing or a similar thing in those days as it means now. Hard to get into, opportunities await you when you graduate. So that's how the study started, and we've asked a number of questions over the years. Some of the questions I asked in the 1930s and 40s are kind of silly. Like there's a question.
Yeah.
So we have all the data, right? And it's stored in file cabinets. We've also digitized it now, so I can access it on my computer. But you can imagine we have file cabinets full of paper and even photographs of the participants. The papers often have handwritten notes from the participants or notes from the interview. So it's a little bit like looking through a family album of some kind. Like I really get to
Truly.
know the participants in the study. And the other thing I want to add is that we're now studying the children of the original participants. So the folks that started in the 1930s, there are fewer than 20, I think, alive at this point. They would be close to 100, most of those participants. But we're now studying the middle-aged children. And, what an incredible opportunity. We know a lot about their parents and a fair amount about the situation in which these new participants grew up. So we're now connecting with the next generation of participants.
That for me, I think is one of the most exciting parts of this. The data junkie in me really got excited. It talked about how, yes, towards the later years, we're incorporating a lot more quantified self, brain scans and, a lot more hard data points. And still including the checking in more kind of essay conversational types of feedback on how good is your life. I'm curious, what can you share with us from the study or your personal insight on, is it the person who is more well, in general good health? Are we seeing that being kind of the deciding factor for having more meaningful relationships and overall quality of life, or the other way around? Or are they mutually exclusive?
Yeah, so such an important question. It's a really good question, Chase, right? So it's clear that there's a connection in our study and other studies between health and relationships, well-functioning relationships in particular. But the question that some people have raised is maybe the direction isn't what we think it is. Maybe it's not relationships contributing to health, but maybe if you're healthy, if you're thriving, that allows you to have good relationships. And what I want to say is there's no doubt that that latter piece is probably true, that when we're healthier and we're thriving, we may be able to be more present and affectionate and connected to other people. I think that's probably true. But that fact doesn't discount the number of findings that suggest the relationship goes in the other direction as well. And we know that because we follow people across time. So we can see people who are in healthy relationships or connected to people in their 20s, but maybe weren't so healthy physically. And then 20 years later, we can see the change in their experience. So the benefit of longitudinal research is you can begin to connect the direction of influence, at least gives you some information. And then, of course, there's lots of research, not from our study, but from a number of other studies that is either experimental in nature that allows us to know the direction of influence, or research on animals. So you can find similar analogs with animals. You can study rat pups or mouse pups or monkeys, all of which have been studied. And you can look at the ways in which their connections or their disconnection, their loneliness, affects their health. And it's very clear that relationships cause changes in our health, that direction, it's incredibly clear from the research. And our research contributes to that, but it's supported by thousands of other studies at this point.
It might be too soon, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it might be too soon to have an answer for this. But it makes me curious about epigenetics. And it makes me curious about ancestral trauma or ancestral happiness. In just one generation, is it possible, again, no matter the age, if you have a high quality of life, meaningful life, in your opinion, good life, and then you have children, is that passed on yet? Are we seeing this as a genetic trait?
So there are two really exciting things about epigenetics, right? And for listeners, epigenetics means that we're born with genes that program certain things in our body over time, certain biochemical or chemical processes in our body. But because of our lived experience, our genes go on and off. They're shut on and off at different points in our life. And epigenetics refers to changes in the degree to which those genes effectively are on and off. And I think what's not in dispute is that relationships have an effect on our current epigenetics. So we have a finding, not published yet, but it's a paper we're working on, that folks that have more adversity in childhood have a particular epigenetic pattern, a pattern of genes being on and off. That's not so good for our health. The pattern is something like this: greater inflammation. So these are genes that are involved in inflammatory patterns are turned on by childhood adversity. Genes that are involved in fighting invaders in our body. So these are, things that could be microbes of any kind, could be antibacterial responses or antiviral responses. Those are turned down, so we're more susceptible to illness. So this study and several other studies are showing that epigenetic effect is happening within our lifetime, that it's having an influence on our experience. There's similar findings with loneliness, and we find that signal here as well. That's one of the common findings, is that loneliness has a particular epigenetic pattern. The epigenetic quality that you're talking about, which is passing on these experiences, is more controversial, is what I would say. And we don't have that evidence in our study. And I think the I think the answer is still out there about how much of a kind of impact this is. This would be the idea that inherited qualities based on our experience are passed on to the next generation. There was some really exciting research that suggested this was a phenomena. I remember I was at a conference and a researcher who does this work came up to a colleague that I was talking to and said, you won't believe this. But the old evolutionary theory was wrong or was right, that there is a way in which we can acquire traits and pass them on to the next generation. I would say the jury is still out about how widespread that is. But in the current life, incredible idea that our experiences in relationships in particular with other people, close other people, influence the way our genes express themselves. Really important idea.
Very important idea, and I'm with you. In my heart of hearts, I do believe that this is a thing. I personally have not gone down that rabbit hole of the hard clinical evidence. It might be out there. Might be piecing together, your work and these other studies, but it just makes me think more qualitatively first, in that right now, as a 37-year-old happily married man who has deep, meaningful relationships with his partner and with family and other friends, I think about, and actually in the coming year, my wife and I are going to be starting to try to have children ourselves. And so I think about how much better off I feel now physically, but also mentally, emotionally, and the quality of my relationships going into possibly bringing children into the world, and what that just is going to mean for me and my mindset and my outlook and my preparedness as much as possible as we can be prepared for children, versus if I didn't have a deep, meaningful connection with my partner, if I wasn't planning on the pregnancy, or if I didn't feel like I had any kind of support system for my children or myself going into this new endeavor. I mean, I know that I would have a dramatically different stress response. I would have a dramatically different levels of cortisol. I mean, sleep, biomarkers, everything I'm sure would be suppressed. And so it's kind of like chicken or the egg kind of thing here, I guess. But it just makes me think more qualitatively first, and then I'm sure the science is going to show us later that it's true.
But I would just change what you said is absolutely true, very thoughtful. Instead of chicken or the egg, it's chicken and the egg here, right? It's both
True.
directions are important.
Yeah.
That's the key idea. And I think, Chase, you're also thinking about something else, which we do talk about in the book, right? We have the opportunity, we've studied these participants across 80 years of their lives, and then we're studying their children. So we have this kind of unique opportunity. We ask the children to tell us about their childhood, and then we can look in our files and see whether that story that they tell about their childhood, whether it matches what we learned about their childhood from their dads, right? That's the real question, and their parents more generally. And the reason I raise that is that I think there is another legacy. So you're sounding like you're about to start a family, which is exciting and also scary. And it's a time when we often think back to our own childhood legacy, right? And just because that childhood legacy may not be in our epigenetic structure in some way, doesn't mean that that legacy isn't important. So the experiences that we had growing up, the models that we had from our parents, we're finding that those things are also important. They're not destiny, but they're part of what influences what we're like, certainly as parents when we have new children. And it also influences how we are in relationships, that the ways in which we interacted in our family, with our siblings, with our parents. We can see connections between that and adult intimate relationships and the ways that parents are with their children.
That's fascinating. That makes me just think, makes me so much more hopeful of, not that life will get, I think, easier for a lot of people in future generations, but just imagine if this happened for every generation moving forward. Imagine if the intention of you being a parent, or the intention of you in a relationship, matched the perception of that child, of that receiving partner, because there's so much struggle and conflict in loss and lack of meaning in quality relationships when intention and perception are not met. That's a part of, I think, meaningful relationships, is working through that and getting hopefully to some common ground. But if I'm hearing correctly, imagine if you take the children when they're grown, match with the story of their upbringing, of their experience versus their parent, their father, their mother, whoever. Wow. If that lined up, that's an incredible new human being, I think.
These are just really interesting questions, right? This is what I get to do. It's part of why I really love the work that I get to do. We've asked this with couples too, right? So we have couples we bring in and we have them have a conversation, and then we ask them after the conversation, we separate them and we ask them a little bit about what happened.
Okay,
In
now
one
really
study,
tell us how you feel.
sorry.
And now you separate them and they're like, okay, now really tell us how you feel about
Exactly. Tell us
this.
how you really feel. And in one study, we actually showed them a videotape
Yeah.
so that they really had to kind of be confronted with what it looked like, that conversation. And we said, what's going on, right? What are you feeling? What do you think your partner's feeling? What are you thinking? So that allows us, again, in a very kind of micro scientific way, to begin to think about the implications of whether it's important for me to really understand what's going on for you now, Chase, in this conversation, or whether maybe what's most important, and this is what we found when it came to couples, maybe what's most important is if my partner thinks I'm trying hard to understand what they're experiencing. I can be wrong. I may not guess the emotions perfectly, but if my partner has a sense that I'm leaning in, trying to understand her, that's going to help us in our relationship. That's what we found.
I have been married for about 6 years now, together with my spouse for almost 10. So that's not nothing, but I can tell you that perception goes so far.
Yeah.
I might have screwed up. She might have screwed up, honest mistakes or just, being stuck in our own world. But when that perception is reality, that that really that saves you from the doghouse, I think. It softens the blow, and I think more quickly allows you both to come together for conflict resolution.
I think that's right. And engenders good feelings. And then it's easier to have those conversations about the tough things that maybe you don't agree on or that are challenging you. So it creates a kind of bedrock of trust because someone is trying hard to understand. And we can signal that directly, right? We talked about appearing needy or not, but a good thing is, and I use this, I'm trained as a therapist. So, occasionally people accuse me of doing therapy babble in real life, and it's okay, I think. So I'll say to a student sometimes, I know you're asking me for something, or I know you feel bad about something. I really want to understand what it is. Tell me what's going on. And that's an attempt to just understand people. I'm just signaling to them that I'm interested. I may not get it, like they may still end up frustrated, but at least they hear me saying I'm interested. And I'm not just saying it for a reason. I'm saying because I really am interested in their experience, that I have grown by studying the folks in our 80-year study. I've grown by learning about their experience. I've grown from all of the patients that I've seen in therapy, that I've learned a lot about life. I feel very lucky to have those models. So when I tell people I'm really interested in their experience, I really am. I'm not just blowing them off and saying, talk and I won't listen. I'm curious.
That's the secret sauce, everybody. That's the secret sauce for happiness, especially in an intimate relationship. I'll tell you that. One other point I want to get to.
Chase, can I jump in though? One
please,
thing, because
yeah.
I'm thinking about your listeners, right? So I'm thinking there's going to be a listener that's going to say, really? Listening to people's problems is the secret sauce here, right? So, I have enough problems. Why do I need to listen to other people talk about what's challenging for them? And I totally understand that, right? Totally get that. But the places where we feel emotion are places where something is important, something is going on that's it has a personal stake for us. And those are the most meaningful times. So part of what I've learned, and this has been harder fought for me, I've learned this over the years. I got a few years on you, but when I was in my 20s, I don't think I really knew this, that if you tune in to people when they're challenged, when they're experiencing those negative emotions, you're going to learn something that's pretty important about them. Now, of course, you have to do it in a way that's gentle and that's also comfortable for you. But we learn how to do that as we grow older. We get better at that. So this is a kind of plea to those listeners to lean in a bit when someone is saying, I'm really struggling, or, I just don't know what to do, or they're angry. Maybe they're angry with you. You can tolerate it. It's okay.
So
it's
well
just a
said.
feeling.
So well said, and I think that ties in perfectly to kind of the last point I wanted to go over. In that state, I would argue that is a person, unless they're just a constant complainer and not actually being productive with their conflict resolution. That person talking to you about their problems, their pains, their struggles is a point of vulnerability. And you talk about this, how mutual vulnerability is actually a source of strength. What do you mean by that?
Yes, I love it. You did your homework well, Chase. You're a good student, I think is what that means.
Thank you.
We build relationships by being vulnerable with others. And the example that I use in the book is actually an example of my co-author. I work on this project with someone named Bob Waldinger. We wrote the book together. Bob and I have known each other going on 30 years now. And Bob was initially, when we first got to know each other, he was kind of my boss. I was training to be a psychologist. He was the director of training, and he needed some help with something. So the first step was that he was vulnerable. He said, Mark, I'm writing a grant. I know you know a little bit about research and stats. I'm just learning this. Could you help me write this? Could you consult with me and sort of help me? So here was the guy who was supposed to know it all. He was the head boss, and he said, I don't know something. So he was vulnerable. And then as our relationship evolved, we talk about this in the book, there was a particular event. It was the birth of our first child. My wife got very sick at the end, and Bob actually kind of reached out in a way that said, essentially to me, you're vulnerable. I know it. I want to help. I want to be there. And I like you enough that maybe we can deepen our connection, right? So that kind of mutual vulnerability, which we built up not in one conversation, but over several years, engendered a friendship that's now lasted 30 years and has resulted in this book, which we're very proud of. So this idea about mutual vulnerability, we display it in so many ways when we're young and we're trying to figure out, who we want to connect with in an intimate way. It means taking a chance and saying, do you want to date? Do you want to go out? Do you want to grab coffee? It can be with a friend. There's the great that TV show Seinfeld. There was a great episode about taking friendship to the next level. And that's really true. Are we just going to see each other in the gym and wave politely? Or are we going to say, let's go get coffee after a workout and let's hang out a little bit more? So that's how friendships are built. That's how relationships are built, by showing some vulnerability. We're so afraid of rejection. For many of us, it's really hard. But nothing ventured, nothing gained is really important here.
So well said. I do want to ask one final question before the final question. In pooling all this information together and really kind of wrapping your head around this study and what it really means, what was the biggest surprise to you, if any, when it comes to evaluating happiness in people's lives for generations and generations, or I should say decades and decades?
Yeah, it's so hard. It's like picking your favorite child, but I'm going to try. My sort of biggest surprise.
Let me recap a little bit. Let me ask you, what was the biggest surprise to you in terms of, I wasn't expecting this, and what was maybe the one other item of, oh, this is no surprise to me that happiness comes from this?
Yeah. So I think the biggest surprise, if we're honest, and we kind of look back at the arc of the study. So I've been involved in the study for the last 20 years, helping to run it. And the big surprise wasn't so much that relationships are connected to psychological well-being, that we kind of knew that at kind of face value. The ancients had talked about that and said that, connecting to other people, to your community. And by this, I mean, religious traditions, Greek philosophy, Eastern philosophies. There's a lot of mention of the importance of relationships. So that wasn't that surprising. But what became surprising was the ways in which relationships sort of get under our skin and affect our physical health. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people were surprised at this. This was like, you better check your data. That can't be true. And we kept finding this in our study. When we looked at other research, people were finding the same thing. And now we're starting to understand, and this is what's so exciting, the why question, why it is that relationships are getting under our skin, or how they're getting under our skin. So some of that is the story about epigenetics that we talked about and inflammatory patterns, but there's so many ways, and maybe it shouldn't be as surprising with hindsight, right? There's so many ways that relationships give us these jolts of energy and bring us down to misery at times as well, that it's not surprising it has an impact on our body. So that would be the one that I think is truly surprising. I do want to sneak in one other, which is,
please, yeah.
I think this is a study, which is a study of hope, that there are folks that came from really difficult backgrounds, not just poor inner city backgrounds in which they lived in one-room tenement houses with 7 other children, but they also had difficult childhoods. Their parents weren't always there, or their parents were abusive. And what we find by studying them across 80 years and following them forward, not asking them about what it was like, but knowing what their childhood was like, is that even folks in the most difficult circumstances can change their life. So some of the folks who had the most difficult upbringing we're able to flourish in adult life. So to me, this is a study of hope and resilience. That doesn't matter where you come from. The deck can be stacked against you in a number of ways, but there are things that you can do to make a life for yourself that's enriching and satisfying and happy. And that's an incredible message, I think, a really important one.
Well, I think you might have beat me to the punch here because that sounds like a great way to answer, I'm assuming how you might summarize my final question. Ever forward, living a life ever forward. We bring so many people of all walks of life here on the show to highlight various ways to turn the adversity before you into your advantage. That's the whole concept of the show and what I was taught and why I'm here talking to you today. So I'm curious, what does that mean to you? How do you live a life ever forward?
Yeah, so if I personalize it for me, myself, it is partly about leaning into all of what life brings, right? The good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. It's what in Zorba the Greek was described as the full catastrophe. This is life. Life comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes and flavors. Some of it is good and some of it is challenging, but by leaning in and experiencing that, that's how we live life. And for me, it's that's in the moment, and over the kind of long horizon as we move forward, for me, it's about growing and learning. That I'm really lucky to be able to study people and what makes them tick. And I teach and I meet young people all the time. That for me, that's what makes a life that's fulfilling and moves me forward by enriching me and learning new things.
Growing and learning and having at least one other person to share that growth and that education with, I think is how I would kind of ice that cake right there.
I love that.
I get
Yeah,
so excited.
absolutely.
I love learning things, reading, listening, watching. I've been a student of life for many years. But then when I think about how even more excited I get to, share with my wife, I'm like, oh, this fun fact, or oh, this guest said this. It solidifies it even more for me. So thank you.
And you're about to have a family, so I'm gonna just tell you, I have grown-up children now. They make fun of me sometimes when I come home and say I learned this new thing, or I had this incredible conversation on the street with this
Yeah.
man who I was helping. But they know it brings me joy. So I love the way you wrap that up. Absolutely. Sharing it with another person is a great way to do it.
Oh, it's the best. It's the best.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate your time. We're going to have this book linked down in the show notes, the video notes for everybody. Check it out. The Good Life right here. Lessons from the world's longest scientific study of happiness. Thank you so much. This was a pleasure to dive into.
Pleasure being with you. I love the questions. Really fun.